It started with a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, barely louder than a passing breeze. But you felt it, didn't you? That strange pull in your spirit, that deep down stirring you couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just a thought or a coincidence. It was something different, something divine. And Archangel Michael has been trying to get your attention ever since. The night it began, you weren't doing anything out of the ordinary. Maybe you were scrolling through your phone. Maybe you were brushing your teeth, or maybe you were already lying in bed, eyes closed, but still wide awake. That's when the dream came. Or was it a vision? A flash of light, and then a presence so strong it nearly pulled you to your knees. The room didn't look different, but you knew you weren't in your normal space anymore. There was weight in the air, glory, stillness, power, and he was there. Not like the angels in cartoons or Christmas cards. No. This was Archangel Michael. Radiant, towering, armed with light and clothed in fire, his sword humming with heaven's authority. But he didn't come to frighten you. He came to reveal something. Something personal. Something urgent. "There is someone," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like thunder wrapped in silk. "Someone who has been crying out to God for you, not just hoping, not just dreaming, praying. Night after night their words have reached heaven, and the Father has heard. And now," he said, his eyes piercing into your soul, "it's time for you to know." Your heart raced. You didn't speak, couldn't speak. You just listened. Every word felt like it was echoing, not just in the air, but in your bones. "This person has battled through heartbreak, loneliness, and rejection," Michael continued. "But they never stopped believing that God had chosen someone for them. That someone is you." You tried to ask who it was. The words fumbled on your tongue. But before you could speak, the angel raised his hand. "You must understand," he said. "The name you're about to hear will not just surprise you, it will challenge everything you thought you knew about timing, destiny, and the way heaven works." Then, just like that, he vanished, and you woke up gasping for air, your pillow damp with sweat, your chest thudding as if your spirit had just come back from somewhere far away. At first, you wanted to dismiss it. Maybe it was just a dream. Maybe it was your mind playing tricks on you after watching a late-night sermon or scrolling through too many spiritual videos. But something about it wouldn't leave you alone. That name. That mysterious someone. You couldn't stop thinking about it. You began to notice signs. A song on the radio with lyrics that seemed too on the nose. A stranger in the grocery store who looked at you a little too long, almost like they knew you. Conversations that echoed the same message. You're being prepared for something big. Coincidences? Maybe. But your spirit knew better. Then came the fast. You didn't even plan it. You just felt the urge to skip a meal, then another. Suddenly you were in the middle of a 3-day fast without realizing how you even got there. You weren't fasting for a breakthrough in finances or healing. You didn't even know why. You just knew something was shifting and you needed to be ready. That's when the dreams returned. This time more vivid, more specific. You saw a figure. You couldn't quite make out the face, but the presence was unmistakable. Safe, familiar. Their hands were folded, lips moving in prayer, and every word they spoke carried your name. God, if they're the one, open their eyes, prepare their heart, let them recognize me in the spirit. You woke up trembling. Whoever this was, they weren't asking for a fairy tale romance or some casual fling. They were pleading for a kingdom marriage, one anchored in purpose, purity, and divine timing. The next day, it hit you like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just about attraction. This wasn't about you being liked or admired. This was spiritual. Someone had been calling on heaven with your name on their lips, and heaven was answering through Archangel Michael. But here's where it gets real. There's a reason the name hasn't been revealed yet. Heaven is waiting for your heart to align. Because this isn't just about receiving someone who loves you. It's about being ready to love them back with the same spiritual maturity and depth. There are things you've been healing from. Quiet. Fears. unspoken doubts, unanswered prayers, and all of it matters. You're not behind schedule. You're not missing out. You're in preparation. And Archangel Michael has been sent to make sure you don't miss this divine appointment. He's been guarding this person too, keeping them covered, strengthening their faith, encouraging them when they wanted to give up. And now, heaven is drawing you two closer. You haven't met in the natural yet, or maybe you have, and just didn't realize who they were. But your spirits are already in conversation, and the timing, it's closer than you think. You feel it, don't you? That low hum in your soul that something big is coming. That feeling you get when you walk past someone and your spirit does a double take. That's not just chemistry, that's divine recognition, and it's growing stronger. Heaven is watching, the angels are moving, and Archangel Michael is still standing guard over you, over them, and over the union that's being orchestrated. Behind the scenes, you're not imagining things. That voice you heard, that dream you had, those nudges in your spirit, they're real. And the story is just beginning. You started to pray differently after that. Not just your usual bedtime, God help me, or Lord bless my day kind of prayers. No, this was deeper, almost instinctive. You found yourself asking God things you hadn't dared say out loud before. What am I supposed to do with this? Who is this person? Am I ready to love like that? To be loved like that? And heaven listened. You could feel it in the atmosphere. The weight of glory around you grew heavier. Your dreams didn't stop. They got louder, more detailed. You began waking up with impressions, phrases, scriptures, even moments from your day flashing back to you with new meaning. It was like the Holy Spirit had flipped a switch in your soul, and suddenly, everything felt connected. You started writing it all down. Names, dates, symbols, things that didn't make sense in the natural but stirred something inside. You wrote down one name that kept popping up. Not someone you'd expect. Not someone you'd ever really considered in that way. But their name showed up in a dream once. Then again during a sermon when the pastor used it as an example. Then a friend mentioned them randomly the next day. Coincidence? Not anymore. You were starting to understand that God rarely works in straight lines. He speaks in patterns, rhythms, confirmations, small divine nudges meant to guide, not overwhelm. Archangel Michael hadn't returned, not physically, but you could sense he was near. Sometimes in worship, when you closed your eyes and lifted your hands, you'd feel that same presence wash over you, peaceful but fierce, like standing on holy ground. And in those moments, you knew he was still watching, still guarding the promise God had spoken. Meanwhile, you were changing too. Not because you were trying to be perfect, but because the Spirit was working on you from the inside out. Old habits started to fall off. That bitterness you didn't even realize you'd been carrying, it started to lift. The fear that maybe you weren't good enough for real love, it began to lose its grip. God was softening your heart without breaking it, stretching you without shaming you, healing wounds you thought had scarred over for good. All because someone, somewhere, had been on their knees asking for you. And now, you were praying for them too. Not even knowing their name for sure. Not having seen their face clearly. But your spirit was reaching out to theirs across space, time, and circumstance. You started to say things like, Lord, wherever they are tonight, cover them, protect their heart, give them peace, help them feel your love even before they feel mine. You didn't know it, but on the other side of that prayer, they were saying the exact same thing. The very night you lifted your voice, they were whispering into their pillow, God, I don't know who they are yet, but I know their worth, the weight. Heaven heard both voices, and somewhere between your prayers and theirs, something holy began to move. Angels were dispatched, assignments were activated, and Archangel Michael stood at the center, the warrior of divine timing, ensuring that neither of you missed what God had prepared. The enemy tried to interfere. Of course he did. He always tries to intercept holy unions, especially the ones birthed in prayer. Distractions came. Old flames reached out. Random messages showed up from people you hadn't talked to in years. People who once hurt you. People who reminded you of who you used to be, not who you were becoming. But this time, you saw it for what it was. A test. And you passed it. Not because you were perfect, but because your discernment had sharpened. You could sense the difference between what's good and what's God. You stopped settling for attention when you were designed for covenant. You stopped responding to every text because your spirit recognized that not every voice deserved your yes. That's when things started accelerating. Dreams became clearer. You began to get glimpses of the life you and this person could build. Laughing. Together in the kitchen, praying over children, traveling to speak at events, ministering as a team. These weren't fantasies. They were previews of a purpose-packed future. And it wasn't just about love anymore. It was about assignment. You were beginning to understand. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a mission. The person praying for you wasn't just asking God for a partner. They were crying out for a purpose partner. Someone who would fight beside them, build beside them, believe with them. Someone who wouldn't be scared of their calling. Someone who wouldn't walk away when the warfare got real. Someone who could love them the way God designed them to be loved. Deeply, spiritually, without condition or confusion. And you? You were that someone. Archangel Michael knew this. That's why he was sent to you in the first place. Not just to announce a romantic connection, but to prepare you for a supernatural one. To help you see that what God was orchestrating wasn't ordinary. It was prophetic. This kind of love can't be rushed. It can't be faked. It's not built on convenience or charm. It's built on covenant. And covenant takes time. But the time is almost up. Because even now, heaven is aligning schedules. You're being positioned. Your footsteps are being ordered. There are divine appointments waiting to happen. Appointments you won't recognize as divine until after they happen and the Spirit whispers, that was them. You've already crossed paths. Maybe once, maybe more. You may not have realized it yet, but heaven did. And the next time you meet, whenever that is, it will be different. Something will click. Your spirit will leap. Their words will carry a familiar weight. And suddenly, all the signs, all the dreams, all the whispers from Archangel Michael will make sense. Because that name, the one that will shock you, it's coming. And when you hear it, you'll know. The next few days felt strangely electric, like something invisible was moving all around you, brushing against your daily routine, rearranging ordinary moments into divine setups. You weren't just living life anymore. You were walking with eyes wide open, and every encounter, every conversation, every unexpected delay or strange coincidence felt loaded with potential. There was a time when you would have dismissed that kind of thinking. You would have rolled your eyes and told yourself, you're just overthinking it. But not anymore. Now you knew better. You'd felt the presence. You'd heard the voice. You'd seen too many confirmations to chalk it up to random chance. So, when your phone buzzed with a text from someone you hadn't heard from in a while, your heart skipped a beat. Not because you had romantic feelings for them, not even close, but because their name. It wasn't unfamiliar anymore. It was the one that had popped up in your dream, the one you'd written down weeks ago, the one you kept ignoring because it didn't make sense. You stared at the screen, just a simple message, harmless, casual. Hey, it's been a while. How have you been? Your fingers hovered over the keyboard. You weren't sure what to say. Part of you wanted to ignore it. The other part felt a strange stirring. Not excitement in the worldly sense, but recognition. Like your soul was nodding slowly, whispering, "Pay attention." You responded, keeping it light, nothing too revealing. But the conversation flowed, easily, effortlessly. It didn't feel forced. It didn't feel fake. It just felt right. That night, you didn't dream, not the way you had before. But when you woke up, there was a stillness in your spirit. A knowing. Like heaven was saying, that was step one. You started seeing the person differently after that. Not romanticized, but redeemed. Where before you saw someone ordinary, now you saw a testimony in progress. You began remembering things they'd said in passing, things you hadn't paid attention to at the time, like how they once said they were praying for God to make them ready for the right one, or how they believed relationships should be rooted in faith first, or how they'd gone through heartbreak but chose healing instead of bitterness. You couldn't ignore it anymore. And then Archangel Michael showed up again, not in a dream this time, but during prayer. You were sitting alone, music playing softly in the background, just whispering to God like you always did. And suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. A holy pressure filled the room. You felt a chill rush over your skin. Your heartbeat slowed, then picked up again. And you just knew, he was there. He didn't speak with words this time. He didn't need to. The message was clear. It came like a wave of knowing, a flood of light in your spirit. Heaven's hand is on this. Don't fear what you don't understand. That was the hard part, wasn't it? The fear. Not fear of being with someone, but fear of getting it wrong. Fear of mistaking a good thing for a God thing. Fear of wasting your time, your love, your prayers. But Michael's presence calmed all that. Because if heaven was in this, if heaven had sent him to guard this connection, then you could let go of fear. You could lean into faith. You started noticing how your own heart had shifted too. You were softer now, more patient. You weren't rushing ahead, trying to make things happen. You were letting God lead. You were content to let the story unfold, one page at a time. That person you were talking to, they didn't know what you knew. They weren't dreaming what you were dreaming, but they were responding to something in their own spirit. They were waking up too, slowly, subtly. And heaven was watching both of you, nudging, aligning, preparing. Then, one night it happened. You were on the phone, just talking about something random. Life, family, struggles, goals, and they said it. Quietly, like it wasn't a big deal. But to you, it was everything. I've been praying for a long time, asking God to send me someone who could really see me. That was it. Your heart skipped a beat, because that's what you'd been praying too. That someone would see you, not just your smile or your kindness or your potential, but your soul. That someone would recognize your spirit in a crowd. That someone would know, without needing proof, that you were chosen. You didn't say it out loud, but something in your spirit confirmed it. They're the one who's been praying for you. It didn't come wrapped in fireworks or thunderclaps. It wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, sacred, like watching the sunrise after a long night. And the craziest part? You felt peace. Not butterflies, not anxiety, not obsession. Just deep, steady peace. Because when it's from God, it doesn't have to force itself into your life. It fits. Even if it surprises you. Even if it challenges your plans or shows up in a way you didn't expect. It fits. You remembered what Archangel Michael had said. The name will shock you, and it did. Not because it was outrageous, but because it was familiar. Right in front of you the whole time, yet hidden until your heart was ready to see it. Heaven doesn't just reveal things on your schedule. It waits for your spirit to mature, your heart to soften, your vision to clear. And when all of that lines up, revelation flows like water from a broken dam. Now you weren't just waiting anymore. You were walking in wisdom, walking in hope, walking in trust. The person who prayed for you didn't just want love, they wanted you. The whole you, the flawed you, the growing you, the anointed, chosen, warrior in progress you. And they'd been interceding for you long before you even knew it. And now it was your turn to believe it, to receive it, to prepare not just for a relationship, but for a calling. Together, because what was coming next would be the beginning of something holy. There was a shift after that night, not just in your heart, but in your surroundings. Things that had felt static suddenly began to move. Conversations started going deeper. Opportunities opened up. People you hadn't spoken to in years began circling back, not for drama, but with apologies, closure, and strange timing that only heaven could orchestrate. It was like the old chapters of your life were being gently closed to make room for the one God was now writing. You couldn't shake the thought that this person, this one who had been praying for you, was closer than ever before. Not just in proximity, but in purpose. Every time they spoke, something in their words echoed with clarity. They weren't perfect, and neither were you, but there was grace in how you both gave each other space to be real, to be vulnerable. They asked questions that reached past the surface. Questions like, what has God been teaching you lately? Or, what does peace look like for you? Not the kind of stuff most people asked on a whim. It was spiritual, intentional, and it stirred something in you. You didn't feel like you had to perform. You felt seen. You felt safe. And even though no official label had been spoken yet, your spirit already knew. This wasn't just a friend. This wasn't a crush. This was the person your soul had been whispering about during those long nights in prayer. The person God had been preparing you for, even when you didn't know you needed preparation. One evening during prayer, you asked again, God, is this really it? Am I hearing you right? You didn't hear a booming voice, no flashing lights, just a gentle whisper in your heart that sounded a lot like peace. You'll know by the fruit. And you started looking, not for perfection, but for fruit. Were they rooted in Christ? Did they repent when they got it wrong? Did they honor boundaries? Did they draw you closer to God, not distract you from Him? Did being around them stir the spirit within you, or did it drain your strength? The answer, quietly and consistently, was yes. Yes to the fruit. Yes to the peace. Yes to the slow unfolding beauty of something that wasn't forced, but forged. Still, you wondered, why had the name shocked you so much in the beginning? Maybe it was because it didn't fit your list. You'd written that list a long time ago. Physical traits, personality types, the boxes you thought had to be checked. But heaven's blueprint rarely mirrors our checklist. God isn't building your life with temporary bricks. He's using eternal stones. And sometimes the person God picks for you won't make sense to your mind, but they'll make perfect sense to your mission. The shock wasn't just about the name. It was about how they carried God, how they walked with quiet confidence, how they knew how to war in the spirit without needing attention or applause. They were the kind of person who would fast for you without telling you, who would pray in tongues at 3 a.m. because they felt your name rise in their spirit. They were the kind of person who wouldn't flinch when warfare came knocking, because they'd already been through the fire and come out forged in faith. That was what shocked you, that God had really done it. He had really heard both of your prayers and answered them, not with someone who merely looked the part, but someone who carried his heart. And in that realization, you felt something else rise up in you. Urgency, not to rush, not to force, but to be ready. You started cleaning up things in your life, not out of fear, but out of honor. You unfollowed people who had access to an old version of you. You stopped entertaining conversations that had no future. You set standards and boundaries, not because you were being difficult, but because you knew what you were carrying now. And not everyone could be trusted with it. Even your prayer life matured. You stopped just praying for love and started praying for unity, for protection, for strategy. for wisdom in how to cover your future spouse spiritually. You found yourself weeping over their soul, their peace, their calling. You asked God to strengthen them on the days they felt weak. You prayed that they'd never lose sight of their worth, even if the enemy tried to lie to them. And without even realizing it, you had stepped into your role as a spiritual partner before the covenant had even been spoken. This right here was why Archangel Michael had shown up that day. Not just to tell you someone wanted to marry you, but to wake up the part of you that was asleep, the part of you that had settled, the part of you that believed God answered other people's prayers but wasn't quite sure if he'd answer yours. But now you knew. He was answering them, loudly, clearly, tenderly, because love, real, God-ordained love, doesn't show up with chaos. It comes with confirmation. And the name that once shocked you, now it comforted you. Now it gave you strength. Now it brought joy when you whispered it in prayer. Because that name wasn't just a person, it was a promise. And that promise wasn't just about romance, it was about revival. A partnership that would shake the gates of hell. A union that would heal wounds, break generational curses, and build something eternal. You felt it in your bones now. Heaven was getting ready to release what it had been guarding all this time. And you were finally ready to receive it. You couldn't explain it to everyone, and honestly, you didn't even try. This journey had become too sacred to be casually discussed over coffee or dropped into random conversations. Not everyone would understand how angels had shown up in your dreams. Not everyone would believe you if you told them you knew who God had chosen for you. And that was okay. Some things are too holy to be handled loosely. Instead, you started moving differently, with more intention, more reverence. Even the way you carried yourself changed. You weren't trying to impress anyone. You weren't out here performing or people-pleasing. You were simply becoming the kind of person who could carry the kind of love God was preparing for you and the person on the other end. They were growing too. Maybe not in the spotlight. Maybe not in obvious ways, but you could feel it in the spirit. God was shaping them in the quiet, teaching them to lead with humility, showing them how to protect what mattered, building them into someone who would cover, not control, pray, not manipulate, love, not limit. You realized now that the shock wasn't just about the name itself. It was about how wrong you had been in the past, about what you thought you needed, about who you thought you'd end up with. You had spent so many years praying for the right person, but now you saw that God had also been working to make you the right person for someone else. That hit different. It wasn't just about being chosen anymore. It was about being ready. Ready to steward a relationship that wasn't centered on surface-level attraction, but on covenant-level commitment. Ready to walk through the fire together and come out stronger. Ready to serve and sacrifice and celebrate each other's growth. And yet even in all this clarity, there were still moments of fear. Moments where you wondered, what if I'm wrong? Or what if I misheard? Because trusting God with something this close to your heart was no small thing. It required surrender, the kind that stripped your ego and stretched your faith. But every time you brought those fears to God, He reminded you, this wasn't about performance. This was about positioning. He wasn't asking you to make something happen. He was asking you to stay in alignment so that when He released it, you'd be able to receive it. You stopped striving after that. You stopped trying to be perfect for the promise. You just kept showing up, kept obeying, kept trusting that what God starts, He finishes. There were days when the connection felt strong, like you could feel them thinking about you even if no words were spoken. And there were days when silence stretched long and heavy, tempting you to doubt. But through it all, God kept your heart steady, reminding you that His timing wasn't just about when, it was about how. One morning, while reading your Bible, you landed on a verse you'd read 1,000 times before, but this time, it hit different. Genesis 24, the story of Rebekah and Isaac, how she was simply going about her business serving, pouring water for camels, And in doing so, she stepped right into her divine appointment. She wasn't chasing a man. She wasn't anxiously wondering if today was the day. She was faithful with what was in front of her, and because of that, heaven aligned her steps with destiny. That settled something in you. You didn't have to chase anything. You didn't have to prove yourself. You just had to be found faithful. The right person, your person, was being led by the same Spirit, and at the right time, your paths would collide in a way that only God could orchestrate. And when they did, it wouldn't feel like striving. It would feel like home. You started praying differently after that. Less desperate, more grateful, less God, bring them to me, and more, God, prepare us both. You began blessing them in secret, asking God to protect their mind, to open their eyes, to silence distractions, to give them wisdom about who you were to them, even if the answer came slowly. You stopped needing signs and started trusting the still, small voice. And in that space of surrender, something beautiful bloomed. Peace. Not the kind that numbs you or makes you apathetic, but the kind that anchors you. The kind that says, even if I don't see it yet, I know it's coming. I know He's faithful. Because He hadn't just revealed a name, He had revealed your heart. And that was the real miracle. That after all the pain, all the disappointment, all the false starts and broken dreams, you could still believe. You could still hope. You could still look toward the future and say, God, I trust You, I believe You, and I'm ready. Because what was coming wasn't just a relationship. It was a divine alliance, something born in heaven, guarded by angels, and sealed with purpose. And when it finally showed up, you wouldn't need to question it. You would simply recognize it, because God doesn't make mistakes, and love that comes from Him always knows exactly where to find you. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when something shifted again. You weren't doing anything spiritual. No fasting, no worship. Just folding laundry with worship music playing softly in the background. That's when you felt it. The atmosphere around you thickened, not in a heavy way, but with a presence. A weight. The kind that makes you pause mid-fold and whisper, okay, God, I'm listening. And in that stillness, a memory surfaced. A moment from months ago that you hadn't thought about since. A random encounter, a conversation that didn't seem important at the time, suddenly lit up like a neon sign in your spirit. Something they said, something they didn't say. A look they gave you that lingered a second too long. It clicked. It was them. The name God had whispered to you, the one that had once shocked you. It wasn't just symbolic, it wasn't just spiritual, it was literal. You'd met them, spoken with them, maybe even dismissed it because it came wrapped in such normalcy. But now, the veil was lifting, and all at once, your spirit caught up with what heaven had been trying to show you. You dropped the laundry and just sat down, not in fear, this time in awe. Because isn't that just like God? To hide the extraordinary in the ordinary? To take something you'd passed over and suddenly reveal, this was it all along. And instead of panicking, you smiled, because you realized something. You weren't late. You hadn't missed it. You hadn't fumbled the promise. God had protected the connection until you were ready to see it clearly. Until both of you had been matured enough to carry it without wrecking it. So you whispered, "Thank you," and got back up, laundry still half folded, but your heart fully at peace. From that day on, something changed in how you carried them. In your spirit, you prayed for them with new focus, not from a place of longing, but from a place of knowing that heaven was orchestrating something you could never manipulate or manufacture, knowing that what was coming together wasn't built on feelings, it was built on faith. You also became more protective, not possessive, but protective. You stopped talking about them to certain people. You stopped seeking outside validation about what God had already confirmed. This was too sacred to be discussed in group chats and gossip circles. You started guarding your connection in prayer like someone who had finally realized this wasn't just about you falling in love. This was about you walking into purpose. There were still no official declarations, no romantic speeches, just a deepening, a growing awareness, an unshakable sense that you were both being drawn into alignment, step by step, moment by moment. And strangely enough, life didn't suddenly get easier. In fact, some warfare picked up. You started noticing more distractions, more spiritual resistance, more moments where the enemy tried to twist your thoughts or make you doubt what you'd seen. You had dreams that were confusing. Old feelings tried to resurface. Old people tried to come back into your life. But this time, you were ready. You knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about romance anymore. It was about legacy, about obedience, about birthing something in the earth that would echo into eternity. And that kind of assignment, it attracts warfare, but it also attracts angelic backup. That's when Michael showed up again, not in a loud or dramatic way, this time in a dream. He didn't speak much. He simply looked at you, nodded, and handed you a key. You didn't understand it at first, but when you woke up, you realized it wasn't a literal key. It was symbolic, a sign that something had been unlocked. Access had been granted. The final seal was being broken. What had been reserved, hidden, delayed for divine timing, it was being released. And it wouldn't be long now. You felt it in your bones. The moment was coming when everything would make sense. When every unanswered question, every long night, every lonely tear would fall into place like puzzle pieces. The connection would no longer be quiet or spiritual. It would become visible, real, tangible. But until then, your job wasn't to rush it. It was to keep stewarding it in secret. So you did. You kept showing up, kept praying, kept growing. You didn't obsess or spiral. You just stayed faithful. And even in the waiting, there was joy. There was laughter. There was peace. Because you weren't just waiting for someone. You were waiting with someone. God Himself. The one who authored your love story before you ever took your first breath. And He wasn't just writing a romance. He was building a revelation. One that would someday leave people saying, only God could have done that. Because when the day finally comes, when the name that once shocked you becomes the name you speak at the altar, it won't be a surprise. It'll be confirmation. You didn't know it yet, but while you were quietly trusting, silently interceding, and preparing your heart in obedience, they were doing the same. On the other side of the promise, that person was also being stirred, woken up in the middle of the night, moved to pray, nudged by whispers of the Spirit they didn't always understand, but they felt them just the same. And even though neither of you had said it out loud, both your hearts had started to echo the same unspoken truth. We're getting closer. It wasn't just in your spirit anymore. Life itself had started to reflect the shift. Conversations began to carry more weight. Certain people and patterns started falling away without drama or explanation. You weren't shedding layers anymore. You were shedding lifetimes. This season wasn't about waiting. It was about finishing the preparation, finishing the personal healing, finishing the last few assignments God had given you as a single person before stepping into a new chapter. You started noticing how intentional God was being about your surroundings. He was decluttering your space, your schedule, and your soul, not as punishment, but as preparation. Because glory doesn't rest where there's chaos, and the kind of relationship you were being trusted with, it required order. So you let him clean house. You let him close doors without reopening them. You let him silence voices that once had influence but no longer carried wisdom. You weren't offended. You were grateful. Because for the first time, you weren't trying to be liked. You were trying to be aligned, and that alignment started unlocking things. You began walking into rooms you used to dream about, meeting people you once only followed from afar. Opportunities started unfolding, not because you chased them, but because you were ready for them. The anointing on your life started drawing the right people in and pushing the wrong people out. And every now and then, there was a moment, a look, a message, a word spoken in passing that let you know. They saw it too. They may not have said anything yet, but you knew the difference between casual interest and spiritual awareness. And this wasn't lust. This wasn't obsession. This was clarity. Still, you didn't rush to declare anything. You let God keep writing, because you'd learned the hard way. Premature announcements can delay divine assignments. Sometimes the best thing you can do with a holy thing is keep it hidden, until God decides it's time to bring it to the surface. And so, you let it grow in the dark, like a seed, hidden, protected, watered by prayer, fed by quiet obedience, and, even though the enemy tried to whisper lies, you're making it up, you're overthinking, they don't feel the same. You didn't engage, you didn't argue with demons, you just kept doing what you were called to do, because by now you understood. The one God sends won't need convincing, they'll already know, and when it's time, they'll move. You also began praying differently for them, not just for who they were to you, but for what they carried. You started interceding for their calling, their clarity, their confidence. You asked God to fill them with wisdom, to surround them with counsel, to keep them focused on their assignment so they wouldn't be distracted or delayed. Because love that comes from heaven doesn't just say, I want you. It says, I want you to thrive in everything God's called you to do. And deep down, you knew that was exactly how they were praying for you too. There was a moment that week when you sat down with God and just exhaled. No words, no requests, just stillness. Gratitude. You realized how far you'd come, from begging for love to becoming someone who could actually carry it well, from striving to receive to learning how to steward. And in that stillness, he whispered something that nearly brought you to tears. You're not waiting on love. Love is being revealed. It stopped you cold, because it reframed everything. You weren't sitting around hoping to be chosen. You were chosen. You weren't searching for your person. You were being aligned with them. This wasn't a delay. It was a reveal. Bit by bit, layer by layer, until the moment came when nothing else needed to be said, because it would all make sense. You'd recognize each other, not by how loud your connection was, but by how familiar it felt, like finding something you didn't even know you'd lost. But the moment you hold it, it fits. And from that moment on, your prayers took on a deeper tone, not anxious or desperate, but full of reverence. You prayed not just for a relationship, but for the weight of it, for the responsibility, for the legacy you would both carry. Because what was coming was more than beautiful. It was holy, and holiness doesn't shout. It settles, quiet, strong, unshakable. You could feel it happening, slowly, surely, as if heaven itself was leaning in, not to fix what was broken, but to bring together what had been kept apart for such a time as this. And then came the confirmation you didn't expect. It wasn't dramatic. No lightning bolt from heaven. No angelic visitation this time. It happened in a simple moment. You were doing something mundane, running errands, minding your own business, when suddenly you crossed paths. Not in a forced or awkward way, but as naturally as breathing. They looked at you, and something passed between you both that words could never quite capture. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't even recognition in the usual sense. It was peace. Like your spirits exhaled in sync, like you both knew, without having to say it out loud, this is different now. And in that moment, you didn't need to rehearse a script or overthink your actions. You just were. Because when God's hand is on something, it doesn't need performance. It carries its own weight. There was a softness in their eyes, a kindness, maybe even a quiet wrestle going on behind. That gaze, because they were discerning it too. The connection, the timing, the assignment, all of it was unfolding in real time, and neither of you could deny it anymore. You left that encounter changed, not because anything huge happened, but because everything small did. You saw how God had been moving all along, how He'd been preparing, both of you separately, but with the same vision in mind. How every closed door, every delay, every no, every redirection had led here, not just to a person, but to a purpose. And suddenly all those prayers from months and years ago made sense. The Ichu, midnight tears, the fasts that seemed fruitless, the loneliness that once felt like punishment. It wasn't punishment, it was pruning. It was heaven saying, "Let me shape you for something sacred." And you knew, deep in your gut, you were walking into the fulfillment of it now, not in the form of a fantasy, but in the form of a partnership. Two people who had died to self, surrendered their own timelines, and trusted the author enough to let him write the whole thing. And as that realization set in, something shifted inside of you again. The release of striving, the release of needing to understand every detail. You no longer craved clarity. You craved closeness to God, because that closeness was what gave you the strength to stand still and let Him finish the masterpiece. After that encounter, something began building, not just externally, but spiritually. You could feel the heavens preparing for the next stage. You began to notice confirmation in strange places, sermons that echoed your exact prayers, scriptures that leapt off the page as if God Himself was highlighting them for you. Even friends began to speak into the situation, not knowing anything, but somehow saying everything, and the signs weren't spooky. They weren't forced. They were aligned. You knew enough by now to recognize divine patterns. This wasn't obsession, it was obedience. You weren't idolizing the outcome. You were honoring the process. You weren't begging for something to happen. You were becoming someone who could carry it when it did. That's when God whispered something again, just as gently as before. You've passed the test. You didn't even know you were being tested, but now it made sense. The silence, the stretching, the long waits, the moments when you thought it had all been in your head. They were never meant to punish you. They were meant to prove you, to show heaven and hell that your faith wasn't just emotional, it was anchored. And now the atmosphere had shifted. You felt it in your body, in your spirit, even in your schedule. God wasn't just moving slowly anymore. He was moving strategically. And suddenly, what had taken years to build in secret was about to be seen in public. But still, no rushing. Because you weren't the same person who used to chase signs and wonders. You were steady now, rooted, secure in the fact that whether it happened next week or next year, you were ready. You weren't ready because of a checklist. You were ready because of transformation. Because you had become the kind of person who could protect what God gives, instead of sabotaging it with fear or pride or impatience. And that readiness? It had nothing to do with external milestones. It had everything to do with your internal posture. So when your phone lit up with their name, or maybe it was a message, or a simple gesture that confirmed they were leaning in too, you didn't freak out. You smiled, because love wasn't surprising anymore. It was expected. You didn't fall into it blindly. You stepped into it boldly. And whatever came next, you knew two things for sure. God was still the center, and the promise was still unfolding. Because heaven wasn't finished yet. Not even close. Days passed, and the shift became undeniable. What was once subtle now stood out in clarity. The way they reached out. The way they remembered little things. The tone in their voice, warm, curious, almost careful, as if they knew something precious was beginning and they didn't want to mishandle it. And you weren't anxious. You weren't waiting by the phone or constantly checking for signs. You had found something stronger than signs. Peace. The kind of peace that doesn't rely on proof, because it's grounded in presence. The kind that whispers, "It's already done," even when nothing visible has changed. There was a day that week you looked in the mirror and saw yourself differently, not just as someone believing for love, but as someone carrying the weight of destiny. The person you'd become, they weren't desperate, they were discerning. They weren't looking to be rescued, they were walking in authority. You didn't just want romance anymore. You wanted mission. You didn't want a storybook. You wanted legacy. And that's exactly what God had been building you for all along. All started to click. Why the wait was so long, why the heartbreak had to happen, why the wrong ones had to go. It wasn't cruelty, it was calibration. God wasn't just preserving your heart, He was preparing your assignment. Because this wasn't just about who you'd do life with, it was about what your life together would do for the kingdom. So you kept showing up. To the call, to the quiet, to the places God asked you to serve, even when it felt small. Because every moment was training ground. Every act of obedience was oil for the promise. You were building capacity, not just to receive the blessing, but to carry it when it came. Then came the message. It wasn't overly emotional. It wasn't poetic. It was simple, raw, and honest. The kind of message that only someone who had spent time with God could send. They didn't come in declaring love right away. They came in honoring the journey. They said they'd been watching, praying, listening. They said they didn't want to rush, but they couldn't ignore what God was doing either. They asked to walk forward intentionally, not to impress you, to build with you. And that was it. Something in your spirit just knew. This was the alignment you had prayed for. Not flashy, not flawless, but faithful. The kind that didn't need to be manufactured because it was mirrored in both your hearts. You took time to pray, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Because when God gives you something this weighty, you don't grip it too quickly. You hold it with open hands. And in that place of prayer, God gave you peace. Not just about them, but about you. About who you had become. About how far you'd come. About the quiet, hidden work He had been doing in the background while you waited. You remembered something from early in your process, a prayer you once whispered through tears. God, don't just give me someone who loves me. Give me someone who loves you more than anything. And here they were, not perfect, not polished, but pursuing. Not just you, but God. And in that moment, everything else faded. The old fears, the old doubts, the timelines you once obsessed over. None of it mattered. Now, because love had found its rhythm in surrender, you realized it wasn't about who pursued first. It was about who followed God best, and that was the rhythm you both had stepped into. Not chasing each other, but chasing Him and meeting in the middle of His will. From there, things didn't get louder. They got deeper. The conversations shifted. The boundaries were honored. The prayers became shared. And through it all, you both kept saying the same thing. Let's do this God's way. And God's way wasn't always flashy, but it was always full. Full of clarity, full of safety, full of reverence. Because you weren't building a relationship, you were building an altar. A place where your love could be poured out in worship. A union that would reflect heaven to the world, not just through words, but through fruit. And as you lay in bed one night, reflecting on how far you'd come, a gentle thought wrapped around your heart like a blanket. It was worth it. Every delay, every tear, every lonely night, it was all worth it. Because what you were walking into wasn't just a promise fulfilled, it was a promise revealed. And the best part, you were just getting started. You sat quietly in the stillness of the early morning, the kind of stillness that only comes when the world is just beginning to stir and your heart was full. Not because everything was perfect or because every question had been answered, but because you finally understood the deeper meaning behind the entire journey. This wasn't just about love. It was about transformation. You had been molded and refined by every heartbreak, every moment of waiting, every whispered prayer in the dark. You were no longer the person you once were, the one desperate for affection or validation. Now you were someone whole, someone ready to walk alongside a partner who was equally whole, someone who had also been refined by fire and ready to stand strong. And that readiness wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. You both carried callings that couldn't be ignored, destinies that demanded alignment and respect. Together, you weren't just a couple, you were a force, a partnership forged in heaven's design, meant to impact generations and shift atmospheres. You remembered all the times you doubted, the nights you cried out for answers, the moments you felt utterly alone. Now, you could see how each one had been a stepping stone leading you to this sacred place. And as you reflected on the name that had shocked you so deeply at the start, the very name that made your heart race and your mind whirl, you smiled. Softly. It was a name you never expected, not because it was perfect on paper, but because it was perfect in God's timing. That name wasn't just a name anymore. It was a promise, a covenant, a seed of hope planted deep in your soul, now beginning to bloom. You were no longer afraid of the future. You weren't scared of what might happen next, because you knew that no matter what, you were held by a love far greater than any human affection, the love of God, the same love that had carried you through every trial, every moment of doubt, every silent prayer, and that love was still carrying you into the unknown, into the divine, into the fullness of what God had always planned. You leaned back, breathed deeply, and whispered your own promise, to keep trusting, to keep believing, to keep walking forward in faith, to keep allowing God to write the story, even when the pages felt heavy or the chapters long, because you had learned the ultimate truth. God's timing isn't just perfect, it's purposeful. And sometimes the greatest love story is not the one that happens quickly or easily, but the one that's forged in patience, shaped by grace, and sealed by faith. You closed your eyes, feeling peace settle deep into your bones, knowing that what was coming wasn't just about marriage or romance. It was about destiny fulfilled, and nothing could ever take that away.